Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked to give you a talk about the relationships between animals and humans, which is a bit of a tall order because sometimes they eat each other, sometimes they love each other, and it's a bit broad. I thought to narrow it down a bit to communication because relationships, if they mean anything, are based on some communication. You must understand each other in some way. And that's really a fascinating theme. And it's fascinated not only me for my whole life, but many people. If you think of mythological figures like Orpheus, who could sing so beautifully that the animals would come and listen to him, and King Solomon with his ring, this legend of King Solomon's ring that enabled him to speak to animals. And in those days, if you look at the Genesis story, animals were still strangely classified. The story about Solomon specifies that he could speak to animals and birds and fishes. They were not quite regarded as animals. And then it goes on throughout history. The story of St. Francis, for instance, St. Francis who preached to the birds and they would come and listen. And he also talked to a wolf. There's the one story about him, and convinced him not to take the flocks of the townspeople and leave them alone, and he did. And then in more modern times, you hear these stories. Eugène Marais had a lot of interesting stories about people communicating with animals, and he himself obviously tried to understand the baboons and succeeded to a large extent. He was absolute a pioneer in ethology, which later became famous with Konrad Lorenz and Tinbergen and these guys. And then ending up with the so-called animal whisperers, horse whisperers and other animal whisperers. We come back to them. Now, any communication with animals is a matter of talking in one way or the other. But obviously, animals don't have as much language as we have. They do have language. They can warn each other, and it's interesting to see how far their language actually goes. For instance, I know that mongooses and probably many other animals have sort of sentinels out, and they warn the mob about enemies in the vicinity. But they don't only warn about enemies, they can specify half a dozen different enemies. Because for some you have to take cover underground, and for some you have to run, and so on. I mean, a snake and an eagle and a jackal are quite different enemies. So they have different, you could say, words for them. But to speak to wild animals, it's obviously they won't learn your language. You have to learn their language. And that's what the whole science of ethology is about. Now, very obviously, it would be easier to speak to Fluffy or Philly or whatever your dog is called, a tame animal or a domesticated animal, than to try and converse with a wild rhino. I mean, it stands to reason that your chances are better. So I think we must first make a nice, clear distinction between wild animals and communicating with them, and tame animals and domesticated animals. Domesticated and tame animals are not the same thing. People often confuse these two concepts. They are very, very different. A tamed animal is an animal that is actually wild and lives in the wild, and you just build up a sort of rapport with it. You tame it, or it tames you. And this is very different from a domesticated animal, because a domesticated animal has been bred for thousands of years to be tame. And tameness is often the aim of selection for domestication, because the wild side of animals is the unmanageable side. So a circus lion is a tamed animal. And many of these even utilized animals like caribou or llamas or camels are actually wild. They've never been bred for domestic use or human use. And so they still totally, their instincts are intact. They can make it in the wild just as well as any of the other wild runners about. And that is different because they have a totally wild set of instincts and behavioral traits. But the domesticated animals are bred, and often for a long time. I mean, we know that the dog has been bred for 12,000 years about, sheep and pigs for about 10,000 years, cattle for 8, horses not so long, about 6,000 years, they reckon. And horses are probably of the domesticated animals the wildest. And for another reason too, because with horses you want their wild traits, that fast running and a bit of nervousness which makes them lively. So if you tame a horse too much, you'll probably get something very much like a donkey or a mule. But these things have been bred for certain purposes, but always, whether people realized it or not, they also bred them for likableness, tameness. Otherwise, you just couldn't handle them. They would be too nervous and too skittish and aggressive, especially aggressive. And there's an interesting thing that happens there. There was an experiment which started in 1959 in Siberia in Russia. And it was taken over by Lyudmila Trut. I think she's still alive, to tell you the truth. An incredible experiment, because they took wild silver foxes and or silver jackals really, and they bred them for tameness. They just selected one generation after the other for tameness. And parallel, they bred for aggression. So they had these two strains. But the tame strain is what surprised everybody. Within 6 generations, that's not much, 6 years, because they can breed within a year. Within 6 years, they had a fox or jackal, which would lick your hand. It would whine when his master left and wag his tail when he comes back, which no jackal does. They don't wag tails. That's a dog property. They allowed handling and picking up. And physically, there's very interesting changes which they did not select for, but which arose automatically. They had floppy ears, short snouts, rounded heads, short limbs. They became cuddly and became cute. And their colors started varying. They became spotty and white and all sorts of colors. The pigmentation decreased. Now, this whole set of characters is what you find in young animals, young mammals. And if these young properties persist into the adult, they call it neoteny. And neoteny is mainly what distinguishes tame animals from wild ones. They always invariably develop the traits of neoteny. And it's quite funny, actually, that humans are neotenous apes. We are, in every respect, like juvenile apes. Big head, small mouth, short limbs, reduced pigmentation, under skin fat layer which doesn't disappear, baby fat which doesn't disappear. And then also in behavior, our curiosity, our playfulness, and our altruism are all juvenile traits. They disappear in adult mammals, but in the juveniles you find them widespread because they are functional for a juvenile. A juvenile is dependent on others, so it must be likable and liked. It is playful because it's still exploring and practicing skills, which you only can do in play, and curious, it's explorative because it must get to know its environment. So in a wonderful way, everything that makes us human, plus the big head relative to the body, is a childish trait. In monkey terms, we are children. But it stood us well. I mean, it helped us become really masterful because mainly of the brain. Now, the guy who, this Ludmilla Trott, who did this silver fox experiment, they did it actually under very dangerous conditions. In those days, Lysenko, this mad non-geneticist who convinced Khrushchev and Stalin and these guys, up to Khrushchev, yeah, that his idea was that genetics doesn't play any part. And communists like that because that means you can actually mold people by environment to follow a behavior, and genetics won't come and mix it up. They loved the idea, but he made the mistake to transfer it to grain and said you can plant it anywhere, it will be get used to it. You can plant grain in Siberia, it will get used to it. And obviously it didn't. It was genetically not fit to do it and died, and he caused a heck of a famine, starvation. And they wanted to close down all these genetic experiments, including this silver fox one, which is would have been a tragedy because we have learned so much about domestication from that experiment and how fast it can be, because you don't need to wait for mutations. You actually just change the reading of genes. You don't even change genes, just the reading of genes, so to keep animals more juvenile. In other words, you just interfere with what we call the epigenetic system, the reading of genetics. And that is much faster than changing their genetics. So, fascinating story. And these domesticated animals are all bigger brained than their wild counterparts because of epigenetics. A young mammal has a bigger head relative to its body. If you keep these proportions, your head becomes big. They're all friendly. They're all curious, playful. So in behavior, they're ideal partners for us and the easiest to communicate with because they've got our mentality, our childish mentality. Now, if we go to the next step, as wild animals, which are just tamed. Now, there obviously you would fare best if you try to communicate with those which are already big-headed and intelligent, like dolphins or elephants or even predators. All predators are relatively big-brained. They have to be a bit cleverer than their prey. So the stories one hears about guys who communicate with wild animals usually involve things like elephants, dolphins, lions, all sorts of more or less brainy animals. But still, you have to overcome the distrust and the aggression. And there's a wonderful, the most beautiful description of how to make friends is not the book, How to Make Friends and Influence People. It's the book of Saint-Exupéry, French philosopher in Second World War. He wrote a book which is regarded as a children's book. I regard it as his best philosophy book. The Little Prince, it's called, by Antoine Saint-Exupéry. And in that book, he has the allegory of a little jackal who explains to the little prince how to make friends with him, how to tame him. And it is an absolutely touching essay. Obviously, it's anthropomorphic, but that's not the point. It is a very, very gripping description of what a friendship is. A friendship is more than habituation. With animals, they always talk about habituation. The thing just gets used to you. This is step number one. But afterwards, you can really start loving each other. And that is what that Little Prince story explains so beautifully. And when you reach that stage, you do communicate, often not in words, only in body language, in sign, in smells. You'll be surprised how many smells you produce which other animals can read. I used to farm with bees as a hobby, and I soon learned that. Always take somebody with you who is scared of bees, because all the bees will attack him, not you. If you're not scared of dogs, except you have a totally mad dog, they won't bite you. But if you're scared, you're guaranteed to get bitten by strange dogs. So they smell it. You have a very distinct fear smell, but that's only one of many, many nuances which animals can smell. And they can read body language to an extent which makes you superstitious. If you want to bluff your dog as if you are going for a walk and take his lead, Konrad Lorenz describes that wonderfully. But you're not actually intending to go, but you go through all the motions. That dog will just ignore you. He reads you one level deeper than the superficial actions. And communication with tame and wild animals is much more on this intuitive level. We call it intuitive, but for them it's very real. And I am convinced that things like your magnetic field, which you carry around with you, is visible to some animals. I mean, these deep sea fishes work only, their only sense is their magnetic field. They can feel everything around them, feel whether it has a field itself, interpret that field. So this is a very real thing. This aura is not a figment of the imagination. It is a real thing, and it is used for certain by things like termites underground and so, and people, fishes in the sea. No reason why it's not used by other animals as well. Just because we're blind to it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The same with this absolute sense of direction. Many animals have a built-in compass in their brain. In the pituitary gland, even we have some magnetic material sitting still there. We can't read it very well, but other animals can. Bees definitely can. And animals recognize strange things which you wouldn't suspect. Recently, they found out that bees, for instance, can recognize human faces, which was a big surprise because bees can't distinguish between a square and a triangle. But a square and a triangle doesn't matter to them. What does matter is anything roundish and its variations, because that is what flowers are. They're roundish and there are variations. And they can, for instance, distinguish between a flower with 17 or 15 petals immediately. There's no doubt for them which is which. And faces are variations on a round theme. So they very soon learn to distinguish them, and they can recognize, for instance, their owner and become habituated to him and tame, whereas they would be still aggressive to an intruder. This is a surprise. I mean, a bee's brain is as big as a pinhead, and still they have these complicated facial recognition abilities. So in some instances, I think we underestimate the animals. In some, we obviously overestimate them. You can't have a discussion with your dog about your computer programs and things like that. He won't understand you. And to pretend he does is maybe fun, but it's not very productive. Now, having said all that, I want to tell you about a few of my own experiences. I had the honor to meet Rory Hensman. He was that famous elephant whisperer from Zimbabwe who brought his animals to South Africa, and they are still in some of the resorts in the Northern Transvaal, big attraction, his generation of elephants, and those which were trained afterwards. Now, the animal rights people were on his neck and on his case. They said he must release these elephants, they're wild animals, it's a crime to keep them. But I saw Rory communicate with his elephants and his elephants with him. And I think it's the greatest shame that he was so maligned. These elephants walked on his farm and had free access to the river and the wild herd of elephants which roamed around there. And they went and visited them, but they soon got bored and came back to Rory. So they voted with their feet to be with him, and not about food. That's the interesting thing, not about food. There was plenty of food, and they actually also fed the wild elephants. But their company, after a while, wasn't interesting enough for them because they're highly intelligent. And they played soccer with them and had fun, and the elephants enjoyed it. They came for it. Even better proof was found afterwards when we met a dentist, an animal dentist, Rautenbach. He lives here at Tabazimbi. And he took cores out of the teeth of these elephants and he could analyze the cause with regard to stress hormones. And then he found this wonderful curve when they were still wild, and they were all orphan elephants. But in the wild state, they had stress that you can't believe it. I mean, elephants have a stressful life. It's not an easy life out there. They have food shortages, they have territorial problems, they have line problems, all sorts of things, and fear of humans. And then you can date, of course, these core samples of the teeth. And when Rory took them over, the stress peaked for a short time, a week. And then it dropped off to nothing. They were the happiest elephants without any stress hormones in their teeth. Now, if that is not proof absolute that they enjoyed it and they had a better life, I don't know what is. So we can build these absolute amazing relationships with wild animals, and we can do it with very little human language. We use human language, but animals don't read that language. They read us. They read because without knowing it, while we speak, we actually give away what we say with our bodies, with our voice tone, with our smells, and the animals can pick it up. Now, the people who do this animal whispering, there are plenty of them, and I think most of them have got a very good intuitive communication with animals. Like these horse whisperers who really can tame a horse which is wild and skittish and aggressive, because the reason for all that behavior in a horse is they're scared. They're scared of people, and they have good reason to be. All African animals are scared of people, not the rest of the world, interestingly enough, because here they evolved with people, and people were bad news. They exterminated 80% of the big animals in the world, but not the African ones, because the African ones were pre-warned that we are bad news. So they are wilder than anything in the rest of the world towards humans. But anyway, these horse whisperers and animal whisperers are mostly genuine, good empathizers with animals. I like Rory was. He was much better talking to elephants than to people. He didn't like people, but he liked elephants. And there are such people around. I think it is difficult if you have that talent to stay honest, because people are so gullible. You can tell them anything what the animals told you and what you told the animals, and they'll believe you if the basis is true, if some of the stuff is patently true. So the people start exaggerating. I saw a talk with Anne Breitenbach the other day. She made quite a name for herself, and she is probably good with communicating. But then you hear communications with, for instance, that leopard, which a leopard just doesn't say, he wouldn't say anything like that. A leopard wouldn't care about another leopard's young. On the contrary, he would eat them. So that was put on, I think. And how she got the information is a different story. I mean, all these guys who call up the spirit of your grandfather, they have a way of getting their information beforehand. So I wouldn't be too impressed by all the stories you hear of communication with animals. I'm much more inclined to believe people like Konrad Lorenz, Tinbergen and all these wonderful behavior researchers who actually unravel the codes of animals and record how they communicate, and often can communicate back in their language. That is the route, I think, which has the most promise. Now I want to conclude with a book which impressed me no end, and that's The Philosopher and the Wolf by Rowlands. He was a philosopher, and he brought up a young wolf, a wild wolf, with his dogs. And he had opportunity to watch them closely and be interested in thinking and in ethics and in social contracts. He read these dogs very, very well, and he read the wolf very well. And he concluded he came to a conclusion which is actually very embarrassing. He found that his dogs were very humanoid. They were probably by their breeding, but also by their interactions, had learned from people to become like apes. And people have what he calls a simian social contract, an ape-like contract. And apes are the most devious animals on earth. Dishonest, absolutely scheming. They will form cliques in that group. The Pasha has got there by absolute criminal lying, scheming, pretending, nothing to do with his talents. That's how their hierarchy is worked out. And their whole life and who gets what is done in an absolutely dishonest way. There against the wolf, a wolf pack is pure honesty. He calls it, Rowlands called it the lupus social contract. The lupus social contract is honesty. If you can smell well better than the others, you become the main smeller or tracker. If you have a good mother instinct, you will look after the young while the hunt is out. If you are strong, you'll be the killer. And everybody develops his talents in that group totally on the table, honestly, and is respected for what he is and never pretends, because it won't go down, because you'll be called upon to do what you claim. So this brutal honesty of the wolves, that wolf could never understand a joke, because if they played pranks on each other, which dogs do, dogs have learned to do it. You all know how dogs will bark into the veld, and when all the dogs run out, they will go and steal their food, that sort of thing. It's a typical human joke or prank. The wolf never got it. He never got it. He could not understand how anything could not be on face value. And it made Rowlands really feel bad. I must say, I was ashamed of myself when I read that book, to see how crooked our thinking really is compared to the honesty of some animals. And then you wonder whether we would do all animals such a particular favor by communicating with them. Thank you.